with looking at evolution, especially in the context of how it relates to theology, I think first what we need to do is understand a little bit of the history, the context behind the development of this concept of evolution and in Darwin's role. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of the intellectual climate at the time of Darwin. And then I'll talk a little bit about really what evolution is. I think people oftentimes misunderstand exactly what we mean when we say evolution. Then we'll go on a little bit to talk about some of the current controversy, in particular the teaching of evolution in schools and this conflict between evolution as is taught by biologists versus the concept of intelligent design. And then come around to how I think that evolutionary theory as a science fits with theology, with Christianity. And I'll end up with making a point that evolution can be used to support atheism. A lot like golf can be used to support atheism. And you know, so that hopefully it'll keep you awake waiting for that. And in the end, I'd like to just make my case for the fact that while some people may resort to evolutionary theory as saying, well, we don't need God, that for somebody who understands what evolution is, that it can be a manifestation of a creator that is much more powerful and sophisticated than the one that is needed for things like intelligent design. Okay, so the time when Darwin lived was a very exciting time intellectually. So for centuries, intellectual inquiry had pretty much been very theoretical. You know, philosophers reinterpreted Aristotle, and if you disagreed with Aristotle, then you were a heretic. And slowly, the concept that pure reason was not adequate to understand the world around us started developing. And people got in trouble for this. If you look in the early 1600s, a fellow that you may have heard of named Galileo, based upon his observations of the sky, came to the conclusion that the Earth was not the center of the universe. So the geocentric view just did not fit with his data. Now, he was also wrong. He thought the sun was the center of the universe, but he was getting closer. This was a fundamental threat to the religious doctrine at the time. The concept was that the earth was the center of the universe. God had created it with man as the absolute center of everything, and therefore, astronomically, the earth had to be the center of the universe. Galileo disagreed. As a result, he was convicted of heresy and spent the last years of his life under house arrest. Things progressed as the rationalists gave way to the empiricists, meaning that in philosophy, it was more and more recognized that what we observe with our senses can really inform what we know to be true. This started developing in the late 1700s, the early 1800s, and coincided with an enormous explosion in knowledge. Also, the Industrial Revolution, geologists started looking at strata in the earth and finding all these fossils of creatures that didn't exist anymore. Malthus, a kind of is commonly cited by sociologists now, made the observation that in any population, the population tended to grow exponentially while the food supply grew linearly. In other words, populations grew to the point where they outstripped their resources and gave the idea that there might be competition. But still, the concept at the time that was well accepted was that species were immutable, that everything that existed today were exactly as they were created. And these strata with species that didn't seem to appear anymore, they started explaining, well, there were multiple creations. You create everything and that didn't work. Okay, let's create again. But in each case, it was an act of creating species that did not change. Well, slowly the data started to just not support that. And a fellow named Lamarck came along and actually was the one who first proposed evolution. Now, he got things a little bit wrong, and you've probably heard some of the examples of how he thought evolution worked. You know, that the giraffe evolved by being a short-necked animal that kept reaching up to get higher leaves, and as he stretched out his neck, then that slightly stretched neck passed on to the progeny. And that was just wrong. But, you know, the nice thing about science is that an hypothesis doesn't have to be correct to be useful. It stimulates thought. It stimulates new experimentation. And so Charles Lyell, the geologist, published his book on the fossil record just before this guy Charles Darwin left on a long boat voyage on a boat called the Beagle. And he sailed around the earth. He was the naturalist on the Beagle. And so at this time, he would not have been called a scientist. He was a natural philosopher. So philosophy got divided into, you know, the theoretical philosophy and the natural philosophy. But up until about the time of Darwin, the concept of science as a separate discipline just didn't exist. So Darwin went off and went sailing around the world and observed very carefully and recorded very carefully what he saw. And as he went from area to area, he noticed that there were similar animals, but of very distinct species based upon their localization. And the time that he spent in the Galapagos Islands was particularly transformative in that there was this archipelago out in the Pacific, this group of islands about 500 miles off the coast of Ecuador, very isolated, and this group of islands were far enough apart from each other that they were isolated. And on those, he found the tortoises and the finches that were the same sort of animals, but had at that time he knew that they were very, very different based upon which island that they were on. And it seemed to correspond to the different environmental conditions on different islands. So some of them were hot and dry, some had mountains and were very rainy, and the makeup of these animals was very, very different. And so recording all of this, came back and brought these birds back that he thought were different species, and they all turned out to be finches that were very, very different from each other, just on this individual islands in this small group. So he started to piece this together and reflect on his observations, and this is where Darwin's important contribution comes in. He was not the one who proposed evolution. He was the one who proposed a mechanism for evolution that has really stood up to the test of time, that of natural selection. Okay? And it's important to know exactly what we mean by natural selection. So we hear it as the survival of the fittest. And this sounds very Fox News-ish. Very simply what it means is that an organism that carries a specific trait, and he was a contemporary of Mendel, so he didn't really know what these traits were, how they worked biologically, but if there is a trait that is heritable, if it improves the ability of that organism to reproduce, not to live into a productive old age, but just to reproduce, then that characteristic, that trait, that gene, will be maintained. And so this is the important contribution of him taking Lyell's book with him to read while on the Beagle, is that Lyell was the first one to really systematically propose the concept of geologic time. So up until then, the concept was that the Earth was about 6,000 years old, and this whole mechanism of evolution by natural selection in the course of 6,000 years could not happen. But when Darwin looked at this concept of geologic time, billions of years rather than thousands of years, and looked at the fact that, we look in the room here, we're all humans, we're all Homo sapiens. I can very easily tell the difference amongst you. We have a lot of random variation. And that we now know that these random variations occur because of mutations. Our genes are constantly mutating. And most of the mutations are irrelevant. Many of them are lethal. But every once in a while, we get one that makes us better able to live long enough to reproduce. Or, if you look at things like the peacock, the elaborate tail feathers has nothing to do with survival, but it does have something to do with reproduction. Okay, so he put this together and came up with the proposal of evolution by natural selection. Okay, so how does this really work? Well, it's easy enough to understand that a gradual changing of what a population is like because of the accumulation of these mutations. How do you get from one species to another? Okay, and this is where the Galapagos were very important, because a very important concept in speciation, in developing of a new species, is isolation. And so in the Galapagos, with these far-flung islands,